Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for this series of conversations on leadership during the first all-virtual session of the United Nations General Assembly. I'm Stephanie Chang, and I'm the Global Editorial Director of The Trust, the custom content studio and creative consultancy of the Wall Street Journal Barron's Group. The theme for the 75th UN General Assembly debate is "The Future We Want, United Nations We Need," reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism, confronting COVID-19 through effective multilateral action. While battling COVID-19 is top of mind for nations around the globe, it's not the only health crisis that is putting populations at risk, nor will it be the last. Today's conversations are meant to look at lessons learned from the pandemic and how the scientific community can better work with the public and private sectors to mitigate threats to population health in the future. So please welcome my panelists today, André Calantzopoulos, CEO of Philip Morris International, and Julia Coronado, President and founder of Macro Policy Perspectives. As Chief Executive Officer of PMI, André is committed to a smoke-free world and to fundamentally transforming the future of PMI, which employs more than 73,000 people around the world. André believes in the importance of science, transparency, and the collaboration of governments, regulators, the health community, and the private sector to drive progress. Julia founded Macro Policy Perspectives out of a belief that independent research can provide the most objective and relevant analysis to inform decision-making in an uncertain world. Julia is a clinical associate professor of finance at the University of Texas at Austin and has more than a decade of experience as a financial market economist. So welcome to you both, André and Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Stephanie.
And thank you to our audience for joining us. We're going to speak for the next 25 to 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll be able to fit in some of your questions during the last 15 minutes. So you can enter those in the Q&A panel. So the first question I wanted to ask of Julia, the recession brought on by the pandemic has put a spotlight on how much global health is a driver of the global economy. And so I'm wondering, how would you measure the economic toll of the pandemic?
So there's, first, I would like to highlight that measuring itself is a challenge in a pandemic. So both measuring health outcomes and experiences and incidents across countries varies and is challenging to compare. And then measuring the economy, because we rely on surveys and information that we gather from people, oftentimes in person. And so the methodologies for collecting information have had to change due to COVID. So I would stress that anytime we're hearing about data, we should remember that there's a pretty big margin of error around data, and we need to be cautious in strict interpretations. That's answer number one. Number two, there was sometimes a temptation to frame the economy versus the lockdowns, the economy versus health. And I think what we've seen, particularly with the experience of the United States and Brazil and other countries where that narrative was advanced and actually didn't result in good outcomes health-wise, we could see that's not a good narrative, that the economy is dependent on health. And whether you have a lockdown that's mandated or not, people will behave to protect themselves and their families. So if there is a health risk, they will behave cautiously. So it's not a matter of freedom or the ability. It's also a matter of really putting the virus front and center in order to restore economic functioning. And we really can't restore the economy to full capacity until we've had that, that public health management really control things and in a way that allows us to move about safely.
André, what are your thoughts on that? On the
well, to follow on Julia's point, what we know so far about the impact on the economy is clearly relating to confinement. and in certain sectors, lower consumption, loss of employment because certain sectors, especially the entertainment, travel sector, and many others have slowed down very dramatically. What we don't know yet is what the recessionary effect is going to be post-confinement and post-loss of mobility. I guess we have to assume, at least as a business, that there will be limitations in mobility, hopefully not complete lockdowns again, as we master better the situation. But this will last probably until the middle of next year. Hopefully it will disappear earlier, but we need to plan this way. And the recessionary effect of that is very difficult to estimate today. We have to assume there will be some recession, for sure, especially driven by sectors that cannot operate with lack of mobility. And there will be some differences in consumer behavior. Because what we learned for the months of confinement, which is using more remote tools, purchasing habits change, it's going to have a lasting effect. And I think as businesses, we need to adjust. Now, hopefully, if we find a vaccine by the middle of next year and we start making it available, we will start seeing a bit of easing, but also people's concern about their health and the health of the people around them and the people who they love will ease because we have a solution. But we need to assume that we will have difficulty and that, now this situation is something we have dealt with in 2008, 2009. We had a recession, we had difficulties, it takes some time, but I think we'll get out of this. And the second thing clearly is we learn different ways of working. And I think that will have a lasting effect. I'm sure we'll elaborate on this. But as companies, we first tried to, put the health of our people at the front, don't allow them to be exposed to all the sanitary measures for the ones that absolutely have to go to work. But longer term, I think work with everybody coming to the office every day is probably unlikely to happen. And I think the third lesson we learned is in a global economy with global supply chains, if you don't have some redundancy in the system, so you have inventories, you have flexibility, you have factories that don't operate just on time or at maximum capacity, that helps business continuity much more. And that applies to government levels, but also company levels. And I think the push of having, minimize working capital, minimize everything, we need to rethink it because that has a significant impact on the resilience we have as companies, as countries by corollary.
Great. So, you've mentioned that companies have had to pivot, obviously, to to make it through this pandemic. And I'm wondering also about how you think the public and the private sector are pivoting together in collaboration, just to handle the economic fallout better together. Just wondering, as the CEO of a multinational company, are you seeing this collaboration happening in reality? And if so, in what ways, André?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I would say, first of all, we talk about collaboration, but why is that needed? I think the pandemic is probably, a good moment to reflect, but this is beyond the pandemic. We talk about climate, many other, planetary threats in a system that is very complex today, the human and economic system, and very dependent, the slightest problem can derail it, as we saw with the pandemic. So I think companies have two advantages. They can innovate, especially with the right incentives, and they have access to people. They have access to their consumers. Because if we want to have significant change, governments alone cannot do it. Companies alone cannot do it. I think the first and most important thing, in my view, is to factually explain to people what the problems we're facing are. Not demagogically, not based on politics, but factually. And the pandemic is a very good example where we had everything and its opposite, and science was buried, and facts very often far away from the surface. So I think the first thing is factually explain to people what is climate change, what the implications are, and then offer them alternatives to their current behaviors. I mean, we see it with our efforts to try to convert people and move them out of cigarettes and switch them, for the ones who don't quit, to less harmful non-combustible alternatives, because combustion is the problem. But you have to explain to people that combustion is the problem. Like in climate, it's not oil that is the problem, it's not fossil fuels, it's the fact that we burn them that creates the problem. Then give them alternatives and explain to them what they are and what they are not. Then incentivize them through demand measures, and then work on the supply side, eventually to give the stick and carrot policy to the companies to innovate, and then put their money behind access the consumers and selling them the solutions so we can have the impact. And the governments have to create the right regulatory environments so all this happen in an orderly manner, and I would say in a collaborative manner. Many of the things we try to achieve, you cannot just have a law and assume things will happen, or just let companies free and assume this will happen. I think we need a very interactive process between public sector and companies and private sector. But we need not to forget that the decision makers for most of things are the people of this planet, are the consumers, because they have to change behavior. And that's how I see it, and that's how I experience it every day in what we try to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Julia, André has mentioned, that these issues go far beyond the pandemic, and I'm just wondering what your views are on, other historic or current health events around the world that are creating the same sort of shockwaves to the global economy, and what your views are on collaboration and how that's worked thus far.
Right. So on the nature of public-private partnerships, I want to sort of delineate two types. One is in normal times when we're functioning, the economy's functioning well, and it's a matter of, as André laid out, sort of protecting the interests of consumers and making sure companies don't misbehave, but allowing that kind of innovation and delivery of what consumers and businesses need. And so there's always sort of a negotiation and a democratic process around that. In a crisis, there's a special role for the public sector. And we've seen that, the public sector is unique. That's in a sense why we have certain government functions, is to step in a crisis and help do what companies simply can't be expected to do. We saw that in many dimensions in the COVID crisis, from the public health response, the financial market response. There is a unique role to be played by the government when the risks just escalate very quickly, and private companies just can't be expected to step in. And then you have difficult decisions that need to be made. For example, is having national airlines in the public interest, and therefore do we need to support them through this period, because we're not going to go back to normal quickly. So are they deserving of public funds? What about restaurants? These are the kinds of decisions that public policy needs to make. They're very difficult. They get fraught with politics, as André mentioned, but it's an essential role because private businesses can't do that, and we saw that in 2008 and 9, and we're seeing that again. These choices coming to the forefront of how do we get through this crisis? We're not through it, and so there are decisions that need to be made as to how to get this economy through the pandemic so that we have a functioning, workable arrangement on the other side. As far as the other challenges, the pandemic was an acute version, an extreme version of things that we've been seeing as our world and our economy has become more interconnected. So we've seen smaller health crises, or less globally and systemic crises, from SARS, from Ebola, where it required multilateral institutions to communicate. It required restriction of movement nationally and internationally. So we have to develop the communication channels and the networks that are able, the monitoring systems, and we need to collaborate. There's just no other way around that. And then in a more kind of day-to-day, something like food supply, our food supply chains are now international. And so we've got, the very critical element of our food that is moving across borders, and its safety needs to be ensured and monitored, and there needs to be communication networks around that as well. So, that is an essential. We are now in a globalized world in every industry, from food to technology. And so we need that public-private partnership to function in a multilateral way. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is some threats to that, some politicization of that, that will harm us all. When we're talking about public health and global interconnectedness, the ramifications of bad behavior, are not isolated. They spread everywhere. And so I think, in a world where global business has been able to use technology and lower cost energy to fully take advantage of opportunities and markets and, this really unified global economy, the public-private partnership and communication and working relationships is more important than it's ever been.
When I'd
Yeah,
like to,
if I may add exactly to what Julia said, I hope governments around the world and companies, because don't think that we all know exactly how, in all details, how our supply chains operate. I think we discovered that we knew a bit less than we thought we know. So in a global economy, precisely, this interdependence is enormous. And nationalism and national politics, assuming that, if I bring everything here, I can resolve my problem, this is not working, because we're interdependent. So it's better to understand that, put that in our heads and say, okay, now how do we understand better how this whole system operates? Because COVID showed that a virus that has taken a toll on lives, but still is not as lethal as other things can be, can take the system down. And if governments don't know where their supply chains are, if companies don't work with them, if we cannot secure the basic things for people in case of crisis, food, water, basic medicines, access to health, and we start fighting each other, who is going to get the masks first and who's going to get the next respirator first, or the next vaccine is coming, I don't think we'll address the issues. And companies need to be directed, because they can be torn away between this nationalism, because, if I have a vaccine and I have to provide it here first and another country after, I'm torn between 5 governments and try to get this from me. So, it's not dreaming, it's being pragmatic and say, okay, it is a global economy. We're not going to change it whether I like it or not. And we need to all work together and get the ideology out, which I'm facing in my own business. Tobacco companies are this and that. And when we offer solutions, governments need to sit down with the private sector and discuss on how to address all these things, because I see this as an early warning of what can happen. If we have a financial crisis, the system can suffer much more. Climate change will bring in migrations, food shortages, different patterns, and we need to prepare. And as unfortunate as COVID is, if we learn from COVID, and we can prepare for worse things, and build resilience in our system and prepare for bad things to happen, rather than just think and hope for the best that nothing bad is ever going to happen. And if we happily forget all that happened after COVID vaccines are available and treatment, and we will go back to normal, I think we miss an enormous opportunity.
Mhm. Well, and I'm interested to hear from both of you what your views are on the role digitization can play in helping to, move collaboration forward. Julia, do you want to go first on that?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that there have been some difficult lessons learned and some good things that have come out of this that we can take advantage of moving forward. So one of the difficulties was the inequalities that got exacerbated by the pandemic. The most vulnerable populations are the most likely to get it and have the least access to healthcare. But what we've seen in the healthcare industry is that the pandemic also forced a big step forward in things like telehealth, which was something that was already underway as a new method for delivering care more efficiently, more effectively. And, there's always, whenever there's new technologies, I think any CEO, I'm sure André will ratify this, it's not just what the technology can do, but getting people, your company, to embrace it and implement it is also as big a challenge. And so it sort of forced a leap forward. Talking to many people in the health industry, this is what I hear, that they, it forced people to make this great leap forward. Now we understand a lot better what we can and can't do with telehealth. And this can help us address some of the inequalities. It can let us get to rural areas or deliver health more effectively to an aging population that is less mobile. So I think there's just tremendous promise from harnessing the digitization of healthcare that can address some of the problems that have only been deepened by the pandemic. So I think there are some definite reasons for optimism in this area. Another, area would be digitizing health records so that, people have easy access, and that lowers how many tests need to be repeated. And that's a real problem in the US. I think maybe less so in other advanced economies, but there's lots of areas where digitization can bring just tremendous leaps forward in inefficiency in the delivery of healthcare.
And André, can you speak to that on the the private sector, the importance of digitization?
I would look at this more broadly. I think, innovation, technological improvements, digitalization is one of those, and it's a very misunderstood term. But the reality is digitalization or digital expression gives you access to facts and data and ability to process them in an unprecedented way nowadays. So I don't think that's an option for a company not to adopt digitalization and technology. It's not the answer to everything, because you always need, as I said, to have the employees and the consumers at the center, but it can accelerate decision-making, and on top of it, eliminate a lot of opinion, personal beliefs, ideological, skews, because when you have data and facts, it's much easier to take decisions, in my view. Now, digitizing a company takes time, because you start by digitizing what is repeated or repeatable processes, and that's where you have resistance. But when it comes to consumer data, be it health, be it in consumer goods as us, where we need to know much more about the consumer journey, because when you switch people out of cigarettes, it's not just one transaction. You have to follow them for weeks and months to make sure they don't fall back in cigarettes, and so on. So technology helps you enormously. They need coaching remotely if possible now, and we had to do it because we had to take our field forces off the ground during COVID. So I think it's a huge promise. Of course, we're all aware of also the unintended consequences that we have to, be careful about access to personal data and so on, but I think that's manageable with the right goodwill. So for companies, it is a great opportunity and we all need to embrace it. But my view is that we can use technology much more also for decision making. You know, it's a bit philosophical, but we live in a world where politics dominate everything and the narrative supersedes the facts. And decision making is very difficult at Congress or parliamentary level because the subject matter expertise required is humongous nowadays. If you look at what a parliament or a Congress had to face 50 years ago and what decisions and complexity of decisions they have today is very different. So having access to people that are subject matter experts in large numbers in crowds and using them to provide the facts and data rather than hearsays and speculation and ideological positions can help enormously decision making, not only at company level, but at country level. And I think that's something we should be looking at.
Great. Well, I wanted to ask this question to both of you, which is science and technology continue to advance at an ever increasing pace? And I'm wondering, looking at the future, Andre, what do you identify as the key element to really effectively harness this progress of science and technology?
Well, you know, science and technology have to be framed and somehow, I wouldn't say regulated because that's not necessarily always the right word, but somehow everything we do on this planet, initially we come with an entrepreneurial idea and a marketing narrative that this is going to save the world, okay? However, you know, we need to be, first of all, transparent that whatever we do has potential impacts on humans and the environment, for example, because I know no service or product, or very few, that their delivery has no impact either on humans or on the planet or both. I mean, okay, our product, being cigarettes, has the highest impact known, and that's why we do everything to change this equation, but many others are. So transparency in admitting where the issue is helps you innovate and move to new solutions that are less impactful. I mean, when we talk about climate change and solutions, we don't talk about zero harm, because solar panels are not zero harm. They just reduce the impact or the harm. But we need to also know the side effects of that. And that's where the regulators need to create the right framework. That's the best way to collaborate between public and private sector. Because if you leave companies on their own, they will maximize probably one aspect, but try to externalize also things. And that's why regulation comes in to minimize externality, obviously. So, and you see, I come from a sector which is highly regulated, and even the new products we have, the non-combustible products, because they're not risk-free, obviously they have and they must be regulated. But the regulation needs to adapt. Sometimes it lags behind, and that's what we see with the technology sector just now, where regulators don't know how to regulate yet these things, but some framing must exist. It doesn't have to be a straitjacket. Otherwise, we fall back to the precautionary principle that unless we test everything and we measure every impact, we should not proceed with innovation, which will stop any advancement in the world. So between these two principles, I think we need to find, you know, free for all versus total precaution. We need to oscillate and navigate in the middle. And that's my position. Never leave something completely unregulated, but don't stifle innovation based on too much precaution or ideology as we face in our sector all the time. Or, you know, people should stop using fossil fuels, or people should stop smoking because that's the only solution. Yeah, but there are people who will not. So what are the alternatives for them, and how we can get there, and how we harness this so it happens in an orderly manner? So that's the way I see innovation happening. We cannot stop it. We have to embrace it. But we should also, provide the framework for it to operate in an orderly manner.
Great. I'm just going to encourage the audience to ask some questions, but I do want to get back to this, Julia. What do you agree with that? That it really takes regulation, but within limits, in order to move.
Absolutely. Look, regulating a society is always a process. It's always ongoing. I think that, what science and technology can do for our human well-being is incredible. And we want to harness that. But, I think one thing that we've learned, in the great global financial crisis, we learned about that we needed to monitor and oversee risk-taking in financial institutions better. And I think we made progress there. And I think the state of the banking sector in this current situation has shown that we did make progress. And I think what we're learning now is we need a major public education campaign about public health, about infectious diseases, about the transmission of these across people, and the kinds of behaviors that we can all engage in that will keep those risks to a minimum. And I think we can make progress on that. We need to educate the population about what they're facing, because it's not going to go away. We may or may not have an effective vaccine. It may be that the disease evolves and that, like the flu shot, it has to change every year. We're not really sure exactly how this ends, but we know that infectious diseases in a globalized economy are a reality that are going to be with us. So I think we need to put some resources into public education of public health. And then I think, again, evolve the oversight in that public-private partnership context. So André mentioned technology. I couldn't agree more. We have moved how we gather information. And we didn't oversee that. So now we've got so much misinformation and people don't trust science and facts as much. We can change that. We can apply the same kinds of oversight we used to apply to, or we always have applied or evolved a set of regulations to oversee advertising, to oversee media and media standards. Those should absolutely apply to the technology companies and social media. Most people are getting their information that way. So they should face the same kinds of standards that advertisers and media companies have to face in delivering information to the public. I cannot see an argument as an economist against that. I understand, from a company standpoint, that's going to, reduce users. And so there's going to be some pushback, but we as a democratic, thriving society that wants to take advantage of what technology can bring us, but not let it undermine our society, we need to move forward on that front. And I think Europe has taken some steps with frameworks to oversee privacy. The US has lagged behind in that area. But again, that's an area where there should be a multilateral discussion, because these social platforms are international. So we need to have a multilateral discussion around that so that we can deliver information that people trust and that people know how to determine the trustworthiness of the information that's being pushed to them. I think that is, again, being revealed by some of the politics that we're seeing. How easy to manipulate. And again, this is not new. We used to see this in, snake oil salesmen a century ago. And so it's a matter of evolving our institutions so that we can trust information.
Well, that. Oh, sorry.
I would also say there is a responsibility of citizens and scientists as well to intervene. Because when you see a lot of unfactual or inflammatory headlines, left and right, and the media have a role to play as well. And I know it's difficult for the media to test all the information sources, but I think also people have to speak up and step up and say, this is factually incorrect, this is inflammatory, this is ideological, but not true. I think society has a role to play, because I agree. people get very confused with what they see. I mean, if we take COVID an example, or the example I see on, reduced risk products in our sector, people can see everything and its opposite, and they're completely confused. And when they get confused, typically they're paralyzed and they don't change behavior.
Mhm.
So I think the media have a role to play in filtering a bit better what is circulating, not only the social media companies, but I also the civil society and people who know that this is factually incorrect need to have the courage and bother stepping up and saying this is incorrect. Otherwise, only one voice prevails, the one that is distorted. And we saw more voices speaking up this time with the COVID because it was a public health crisis, but not enough, in my view.
Yeah, that actually, that sort of answers the question, one of the questions that was asked from the audience, which is, do you believe that we have a crisis of trust, not just in current leadership, not just political, but also in the public and private sectors that needs to be addressed to engage populations in improving their conditions? And so it really sounds like you're saying, both of you are saying that, yes, that is an issue, is that their trust is the first problem that we're facing right now, and transparency needs to be happening in every sector.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I would add to what Andre said, I fully agree that, public citizens, we need to be we all need to be part of this. We all need to see it as our role to be part of that, promotion of good information and vetting of bad information. And I think, maybe this is naive, but I do believe that people are learning better. With the innovation of social media, we didn't always understand that this was a problem. I think people understand this is a problem now. I think more people are starting to take that second level in their thinking. You receive information, you say, what's the source? Is this reliable? I think that is, we do evolve, we do learn. And so it was new and it sort of washed over us in ways that we weren't always sure of what the ramifications are. I think people are learning. I think regulators are learning. The companies themselves need to learn. Yes, I agree, the media is part of it, but I think the big frontier is the technology and social media platforms. They need to be part of it too. And we all need to be part of it.
We just got another question, which is, do you think that low and middle income countries could be part of the discussion, knowing that they are very attractive markets, but they don't play a relevant part in international decision making? Andre, do you want to weigh in?
Of course, they should participate. Now, we know there is no ideal world here, okay? The more powerful countries take more of the decisions because, and that's part of also the discussions we have about a certain type of reform of the United Nations and the World Health Organization, and because there is disproportionate influence by big countries. Now, again, we cannot be dreaming, but we should not forget that, the countries that have the more problems in times of crisis or difficulties are the countries that are the least, heard or. So I think we need more balance here. And we should not forget that the developing world has much more population and much more consumers, if I take a company perspective, than the developed world. Yes, their incomes are not there yet, but I think they have a very important role to play, okay? Now, what is the forum for that? That's the key question. And we discussed previously about multilateralism and openness and oppose nationalism. My fear is we'll see more nationalism as we have more crises in the horizon, and we all need to resist this. It's not in the interest of companies, for sure, especially multinational companies, to have nationalism or crisis or frictions between countries. And I hope we can all play as CEOs of companies an important role in telling governments that try to play too much the nationalistic politics, that this is not necessarily the solution long term. Okay. Yeah, I understand that sometimes people get angry that some jobs have moved out of their country and went to other countries. But in a global economy, many things come back that benefit, and I'm not going to give basics of economics. Any case, I think, we have a trust crisis, as we discussed previously. Trust in governments, trust in companies, and most importantly, trust in what people hear, because they don't know whom to believe. If I take a quick example from our sector, with all the discussions they've been on e-vapor products in the US and so on, some of them completely wrong and based on absolutely not factual science. 55% of the people who smoke believe that e-vapor products are worse than cigarettes, and they continue smoking. And somebody has to be accountable for that confusion. We cannot hold only companies accountable for their narratives, or governments. Sometimes the people who spread or undermine trust should be held accountable. And I think the confusion, for a variety of reasons, is even bigger in developing countries, because it's more hearsay, less access to factual, and they suffer more from that because also their social support systems and their health systems, as we've seen with COVID, are not up to the level. I mean, we struggled in the developing countries, but if I take, Latin American countries, South Asian countries, we saw much more difficulty, and where people are faced. We should not forget that these countries have also very many daily workers that earn income on a daily basis. They lost it immediately. They suffered much more. They've suffered from the confinement and much less access to health. So they're disproportionately impacted, and I think they have their right and they deserve some attention. And not all of us in the developed world focusing on ourselves during COVID. And I think, as I said, the vaccine will be an acid test. How governments are going to deal with vaccine availability and distribution. Because if we don't start thinking about this on a multilateral basis today, we will have a lot of problems in 6 months or 12 months from now. And the developing countries are going to be the losers of that, unfortunately, not the winners.
Stephanie, I'd like to just add to, one of the really interesting things about the COVID-19 pandemic was that some of the smaller, less developed countries, less wealthy countries in Africa and Southeast Asia actually had some of the most innovative approaches and did very well in containing the virus, sort of much better than expectations and much better than some advanced economies. And so I think it sort of revealed that sometimes the smaller countries, why did that happen? Because these countries had had experience with SARS and Ebola before, and it was very tangible and very real. And they had thought through some of the challenges and the issues and some simple solutions that can be highly effective and affordable in a lower income country. And so I found that very encouraging. And, smaller countries can sometimes teach bigger countries, they can innovate. It's a smaller environment. They have more scope to innovate, try something different. And if it works, it can serve as a lesson to others. So I think the COVID-19 had some really nice examples, again, in the African and Southeast Asian countries of this, that ultimately some of the advanced countries ended up following simple guidelines that can be extremely effective in controlling a public health risk. And then I would just add too that they have the most to lose if we break down this multilateralism approach. They don't have the big diversified economies that could plausibly sort of turn inward to some extent. And so it really is important to engage and build these communications, not always relying on the big countries to lead the way, but to build collectively those lines of communications amongst the smaller economies and countries.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I had a couple more questions for you, and so did our audience, but that's all the time that we have. I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today, to our audience, and to thank my panelists, Andre and Julia, as well as thanking our partner PMI.